everybody, and welcome back to WCCA TV's Tech Safe program here in Worcester, Massachusetts. We'd like to extend our gratitude once again to Adam Rice, who's our producer. And we are delighted to continue this wonderful conversation with our guest from Ireland, IT specialist Allan Brennan. And we just spent episode 39 talking about what he has done in his career. He's been in IT for decades, and he transitioned into the wireless space. And then his children began getting sick from the wireless radiation in schools, which of course we didn't know at the time that was the cause. But because he did his due diligence, he found the science on it, and he quickly connected the dots. And then he worked with his schools to start making adjustments to the systems. And what Allan was telling us is that all of this technology has been way oversold, and we'd like to pick up the conversation there. So, for example, Allan, in the school where your children attended, how many wireless access points were installed, and at what power levels were they being transmitting?
So they installed a total of 24 access points. I think there's 18 or 19 classrooms, small classrooms, and then there's a couple of relatively small offices. There's one room, and it's probably only 2.5 meters wide, 4 meters long. It's like a storeroom. They even put one in there. It's like a tiny little storeroom where nobody goes. They had it like a wireless access point. Any room that they could find, they just put a wireless access point in there.
So as an IT professional, knowing what you know, for a school that size, how many access points would be needed if the school chose to stay with wireless? And we are certainly not advocating that, because there is no safe level of man-made radio frequency microwave radiation in the scientific literature. But we realize schools are at one point today. We can do the gap analysis to see what has to happen to get to safe technology, but there's got to be a transition period. So let's say I was an IT director at a local school. I'm not an engineer, but I've been doing technology for a few years. And I'm not really. I'm a technical writer, but I'm not. What would you say to them? How much is too much right now? And how do we get from where we are to where we can start backing off and still having the connectivity for those moments where we actually need to connect to the internet? What do we do?
Obviously the first and best choice is no Wi-Fi in schools. That's the best choice. Do not expose children to pulsed microwave radiation. That's it. It's legally recognized as having an adverse effect on cognition. So of all places, where children are in a school environment trying to learn, the last thing they need is, wireless signals being sent to their brain that are adversely affecting their cognition. That just doesn't make sense at any level. But if you do have Wi-Fi and you're thinking, okay, we're gonna transition away from we're gonna transition back to the wire. And even if you're not going to transition back to the wire, the first thing you have to do is you have to be compliant. If you're not compliant with FCC regulations, one or more parents will have a case against you.
Compliant with what?
Well, they're breaching FCC regulations.
Where are those regulations? Because the only thing I've heard about is the cell tower siting application regulations. So for many of us, you are the first one to tell us that there are additional regulations that apply to the indoor infrastructure that's been installed. Can you kind of walk us through that?
So the difference between the mast that's outside, that's blasting you 24 hours a day, that's licensed frequency. In general, that's licensed frequency or licensed spectrum. And licensed signals have regulations that apply to the licensed signals. Okay. So then you've got Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, which are the classic unlicensed wireless technologies. And so they would be, generally speaking, inside your home. It's going to be in your smartphone. It's going to be you've got a Wi-Fi router inside the house. Just because they're unlicensed doesn't mean they're not subject to regulations. They do have regulations that limit the maximum output power of these devices.
Okay, so we're talking output power. That's what has to be within the constraints of the law.
So whether a spectrum, whether a wireless signal is licensed or unlicensed, there still are regulatory limits that apply to both. That basically the difference between like a sort of unlicensed and licensed is, for as far as unlicensed go, the regulator don't issue me a license to use Wi-Fi. That's why it's called unlicensed, because I don't have to have a license to use it. And because it's unlicensed, they kind of think, oh, all right, well, we haven't given them a license. We'll just, we have these regulatory limits that apply to unlicensed Wi-Fi systems, but we're not really going to chase them up because it's all of our time is spent on looking after the licensed guys because they're the ones that paid, they gave us money for a license. So the unlicensed side of things tends to kind of get forgotten about. But that suits industry down to the ground.
So it's kind of like a free playground out there for them. They can do whatever.
It's a Wild West. It's a Wild West. It's a wireless Wild West when it comes to unlicensed technologies. So
when we were on break, you were sharing with me that, say, for example, the Cisco systems.
Yeah.
The IT department at the school receives a box. It's got a Cisco router or some other component in there. And those are not calibrated to the regulations.
They're not configured. It's calibration is slightly so they're not
wrong word. Sorry.
So that will be to if you have some sort of a wireless scanning device like a spectrum analyzer, you'll have to calibrate it. But as far as the route, these access points and routers that are coming from Cisco or the access controllers, when they get put into a customer premises, they're not pre-configured so that they're compliant with FCC regulations. And it would really help schools if they were. So when the school got the Cisco box and opened it up and switched it on, the technical director shouldn't have to worry about, am I going to be compliant or not? Will this comply with FCC regulations? The technical director wants to open it up and think, right, great, I'm sorted. I'm not going to, this complies with FCC regulations. I don't have to do anything. I just have to now worry about configuring different aspects of the wireless access point. But I shouldn't have to worry about the regulatory side of stuff. And it's very, very easy for Cisco to do that. It's really easy for them to do it. It's the same with Wi-Fi devices. Wi-Fi, the default setting for a Wi-Fi device should be minimum power level.
Right.
When you knock on a Wi-Fi device, it should just be kicking out like the minimum power, not the maximum power, the minimum power. And for most cases, if you're just talking about, sending a signal around in a room, minimum power is more than enough for a room.
So in our upper elementary school at the David Mendez School here in Ashland, Massachusetts, when we were invited in as a community to go in and see the beautiful new school, I went for a tour. And as the tour group would go from room to room, I would hang back and I would take measurements. This is the Safe and Sound Pro 2 radio frequency detection meter that was recommended at the EMF medical conference. And I had my iPhone 7, my glorified clock camera, in airplane mode, nothing radiating me. And I took little clips, 1 to 2 minutes, in many of the classrooms. Everywhere I went, it was in the red zone, and that's extreme. Indoors, the scientific literature wants us to be at 10 microwatts per square meter. I was getting readings inside the classrooms right above the students' desks of 30,000, 40,000, 70,000 microwatts per square meter, and we want to be at 10 or less. And outside the principal's office, where they've got a dropped ceiling and a ruckus access point there, it was like at 116,000 right outside of this poor woman's office. So these are the realities that we're about to send our kids back to this school year, getting these overpowerings of microwave radiation. And there's been some really good press around a new book that came out this year by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation. And he's certainly spot on that all of this excessive screen time is really doing a number on our children socially and emotionally. And for the boys especially, it's having a big impact with the gaming addictions and pornography use. And in here, he says, short of any chemical in the air or the water, I think it's the introduction of the smartphone to our kids that really started causing this whole epidemic of anxiety and depression. And so we're looking forward to speaking to him and saying, it's not in the water. It is in the air.
Yeah.
And it's radio frequency microwave radiation that is very well documented to be a neurotoxin that's causing so many of these. So it's not ever going to be just one thing. You still need to eat a healthy diet, stay away from the chemicals. You need to exercise to put good energy into your body. But it's not just eat right, diet, and exercise anymore. It's now your environmental exposures. And this microwave radiation is a big one. So we just did a book group on this last night, which was really insightful. We had Dr. Magda Havas, who's one of the leading scientific researchers on electromagnetic fields from Canada. And that video will be available in probably by the time that this episode comes out. So we can't keep ignoring this. But one of the things that Dr. Haidt talks about in here is somebody did an experiment one time where there was somebody in a room by themselves filling out a questionnaire, and they put something that looked like smoke, it was some sort of vapor that was non-toxic, in the room. And when the people were there by themselves, they looked at it and they went to go find somebody to report it and say, hey, something's going on in there. But when you got a number of people in the room and that vapor came in, what did they do? Nothing. Because they're looking around going, well, if that guy doesn't seem to think anything's wrong, I'm not going to say anything. And I think every time I go before a school board or a municipal board, that's the kind of reaction that I get. It's this group paralysis thing that goes on, or if one person has misinformation, everybody gets behind that, rather than doing their homework. And that's why I do 2 free public education webinars every month. In the month of August, we're going to focus on the schools. So safer tech possibilities at school. We're going to do 1 episode by Zoom on August 12th at 12 noon. That's next Monday. And then August 29th at 6 p.m. And these are both Eastern time. But we're doing our level best to get the information out there because, as Allan will tell us, it's not rocket science to fix this. But it's a complete uphill battle because industry was so persuasive at selling these expensive units, and the more the merrier for them, right? The path of least resistance, more power. So, Allan, what do we do?
The school has to be compliant. That's the very first thing.
Okay.
The school. So even if the school think that Wi-Fi is fine, I mean, obviously it's not. But even if they do, they probably do believe that right now. That hopefully that will change pretty soon.
So if these guys are not engineers and they're, do you think IT directors know what compliant even means in this space? Like, how do they go find out what is the regulation and how do I meet it?
So I'm going to show you. I'll show you the where the regulations are, and then you'll be able to contact the school with the regulations and say, please confirm that that the system is compliant as per these guidelines. Mm-hmm. Or you can contact the school, and if you did, you could contact the school first and say, please show me what's supposed to happen before wireless installation is a thing called a site survey. What's supposed to happen is there should be a pre-installation site survey and a post-installation site survey. So when there's a site survey, guys will come along, or men and women come along, they'll walk around, they'll check out the school, and they'll determine how many access points are required. If a school is putting access points into every single classroom, I would ask for a copy of the site survey anyway. They may or may not have it. And then I would also ask for a copy of the power settings that are used in the school devices. Mm-hmm. So the school will then send you, in my case, I spoke to the school. I said, what are the power settings? And they turned around, they said, it's set to 100. Right, so 100 in this case, let's just say for arguments, let's just say 100 is the maximum.
So more power is basically what they're thinking. More power is better, and it's complete
so these
overkill.
Guys had cranked up the power to 100, and I said, okay, so you're telling me that the transmit power is at 100, and the guy said, yeah, and I said, are you sure? And he said, yeah, and I said, how do you know? And he said, because I spoke to the company I was talking to somebody from the school. They said, I spoke to the installers yesterday, and I confirmed it that the system is set at 100. Now the legal limit is 100. And I said to them, okay. I said, if the power is set at 100, which is the legal limit, that means every single box in the school is in breach of regulations. And he said, why? I said, because there are two parts to a wireless system. It's not just the radio that you set to 100. I said, there's also an antenna. So the antenna will take your 100, and in this case, let's just say it doubles it. So all of a sudden, what's coming off the box is 200 because your 100 power level has been doubled by your antenna. The guy's face nearly dropped. He was staring at me, and I said, "Look, I don't want to get this. I don't want to get school into trouble. Because apparently there was something like it might be something up to like 250 grand. You can be fined. If you're a repeat offender. Because it is a workplace health and safety issue. So that's when he realized, and he said, "Okay, right, I'm going to get it turned down to the minimum." So. He got everything turned down to the minimum, and then later on it was turned off. So it kind of worked out.
And even down at the minimum, the connectivity was fine. They didn't lose any service in that, right?
There was only no one was using the system. There was only 28 laptops in the whole school, 500 children, 450 children never ever used the system. The laptop caddy was only wheeled around to a couple of classrooms on a Thursday and Friday.
And yet that power was radiating the entire school all day, and no wonder your kids
children, 4 or 5 year old little kids who are just they're tiny little children sitting in the classroom being blasted with chronic levels of radiation for no reason because they can't use it. Like they don't have laptops. It's a no electronics device policy school. So
it's
what
wild.
You can do is, so if you ask the school, you can contact the school and say, send me the technical details of the access points inside my, in the school. And they should provide them to you.
And what should we be looking for? Because we're not technologists.
So, and that's what I'm going to do, but I don't know if we're going to do it right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the levels that are, these are the FCC levels that they have to be compliant with. And if they're above them, then you need to turn it down.
Do you have that in a document that we could share when we share this video?
Yeah, it's a Cisco regulatory compliance document.
Okay, I would be very grateful if you would email that to me. I will create a link to it. If it's not already.
I'll send you the link. I'll send you the link because it's a 20. I mean, I obviously have it downloaded, but it's a 20 meg file, so it's not great for email. But I can send you the link, and you just click on the link and download it. But
link is good. Well, that's great. I remember years ago, one of my colleagues out in Silicon Valley was working with the Palo Alto School District out there, and they came up with a couple of different solutions. One, when they upgraded and brought in the 5 gigahertz system, they never retired the other system, which wasn't even being used anymore. So they had 2 systems running concurrently, throwing out all that additional radiation. So the first thing is to check your equipment and see if you're really actually using everything that's turned on. And then the second thing they did was, as you indicate, turn down those power levels. And they were able to take them down by maybe 90% or more and still have all the connectivity that they thought they needed. So that was a really good interim step to just not go full tilt with everything. It's the same thing with our phones. Why do we leave all these different antennas on? Cellular, data, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, locator, hotspot, 5G. There's dozens of them in here now on 5G phones. And if you're not using that particular service, once you know it's a biological hazard, why would we leave those antennas on when we can go right into the settings and just turn them off? So here in the U.S., our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has something called the ALARA principle, which stands for as low as reasonably achievable. And that's what they use for ionizing radiation, or the kind that can break the atom. And it's high time that they recognize that that needs to be applied to non-ionizing, man-made, low-level microwave radiation as well. So if we can get to as low as reasonably achievable during the transition, then that would save a lot of students and staff from getting all these symptoms that you described in our last episode: the headaches, the nosebleeds, the nausea, the mast cell dysregulation in the gut, the skin problems, the neurotoxicity with anxiety and depression. It's needless. And we have fallen into this pattern with industry that just because they say we can doesn't mean we should. So we're very grateful for these opportunities to educate. And we've got about 6 minutes left, Allan. What else do we need to know to work with our schools?
Okay, so it's just this is a kind of a I'm imagining the worst case scenario. So in my head, so the worst case scenario is like the elementary school, or like what happened in my children's school. So where you've got an access point in every single classroom. What am I going to do with that? So the first thing you're going to have to do with that is you're going to have to turn not just down to the compliant level, because the FCC compliance level is way too high for a classroom. So you would have to turn the power down to the lowest it will go. So for example, in the the Cisco 9130 that or even the Ruckus that's in your elementary school, if that was set to a power level of 1, if the transmit power level was 1, that would be more than enough for the classroom.
And it's set theoretically at 100.
Well, no, it's worse, because like on the
the
Cisco
multiplying.
The Cisco one that says we're reading the Cisco documentation, it says that the transmit power is 400. So you've got 400, so even if it was reduced, that's why I said earlier on, if you reduced that kind of an access point, that 400, 50% reduction is not enough. That's down to 200. 75% reduction is not enough. You've got to crank it all the way down to sort of 99%. And even then, with the Cisco, it's still not enough. And the reason it's not enough, built into the Cisco device, it's got the antenna gain is 6. So it means that if your radio is set at 1, that antenna gain 6, what happens is it every 3 doubles it. So an antenna gain of 3 turns the power up to 2. An antenna gain of 6 turns the power up to 4. 4 milliwatts may not sound like much, but that is way too much for a small classroom. You don't need it. You don't need that kind of power.
And we know that these signals all go through walls and ceilings and floors, so it's not contained within that one classroom. You're getting this pebble in a pond ripple effect in all directions.
Well, here's the thing. So in the school, they're using 5 gigahertz. And that has, from a penetration point of view, that's not quite as good as penetrating walls as say 2.4 gigs is. So if you crank the power down to sort of as low as it will go in the 5 gigahertz range, the chances are that the majority of that is going to be kept inside the classroom, with the exception of the side of the classroom that's got windows. Obviously, it's going to go out a little bit through the windows. But now again, I'm thinking that there's concrete walls in the school. If they're stud partition walls, it probably will leak into the next classroom. But if they're concrete walls, there's a good chance that would contain the signal reasonably well. So the classroom, they've got a Wi-Fi access point. We don't really want to, but it's turned down to the lowest power level. Next thing we want to do is, so all the children have laptops. Ideally, what we do is we would turn off the Wi-Fi on all of the laptops, and instead of using the built-in Wi-Fi on the laptop, what you do is you get like a little USB Wi-Fi. So you plug it into the back of the machine, and then you move it over somewhere on the desk, so it's away from the child. So the signal is just coming in, hitting that Wi-Fi USB adapter, being brought down, via USB cable into the machine, and then you've got access. So it just helps keep the radiation exposure away from the children, because
right. And in an ideal scenario, if you have one of those access points in the classroom, they all have a couple of Ethernet ports in them, so you could literally just drop an Ethernet cable down to table level and then use an Ethernet switch, which would allow you to plug in multiple devices.
That's a way better solution.
Yeah, and then you just buy the little dongles,
Yeah. Sorry, I was thinking. Yeah, no, that's right. That's far better.
Yeah, that's the end game. If indeed you decide that you need to have technology in the classrooms, there was a 3-part expose that the New York Times did some years ago. What are Silicon Valley executives doing with their children? Well, they're sending them to schools with no technology, not wireless, not wired. They know a child's brain does not properly develop in front of a screen. They need movement, they need physical touch, they need to be with their peers and trusted adults, and they need to be out in nature. And one of the strong messages in this book, The Anxious Generation, that's getting talked about, his guidelines are no cell phones in schools, and don't give kids cell phones until they're 16, and then teach them to use them responsibly. But we have replaced childhood with technology, and these kids are suffering. So we need to get tech under control in the schools, if not gone. It can certainly have its place and its purposes, but it should not be the first go-to. We need actual teaching and parenting, and kids need to be outside bombing around with their buddies and learning how to set rules and how to set, rules of play and game, and get a little bruised up and learn how to be resilient. So we're so grateful for this book because it's opening the door, and now many schools across the United States and Europe and Canada and elsewhere are taking cell phones bell to bell and putting them away. We need to now teach them to do that safely, so they're not putting 20 or 30 cell phones, in one corner of the room where the kids sitting there are going to get bombarded with the radiation from the cell phones. We need to teach them to turn the phones off during the school day and make sure that we take control of the wireless access points that are going at full tilt when we don't actually really need that much power, if any at all. So, Allan, you have been so wonderful to give us your time today, and we'll be in touch again. If anything that you can send me that would make it easier to have this conversation with schools, to say, either from a legal perspective, sadly, we have found that most public servants are not public leaders, so oftentimes until they're made to do the right thing, it doesn't happen. And sometimes that translates into saying, you are out of compliance, and if you don't fix it, we're going to sue you. Right? Sadly, that's what gets things going. So, but whatever tips you have, I'm going to be doing these webinars, and we would love to include any materials that you want to share to help our schools come into the fold and do right by the students and the staff. So thank you again for your expertise and for your courage to talk about this, because we know it's not easy. We all thought we were doing the right thing with Wi-Fi, but guess what? Big tobacco on steroids. So we just need to do what we can from where we are, and we're very grateful for your technical expertise, and we hope you have a tech-safe day.